Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Randy Welsh, the Executive Director for the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance. We're pleased that you've joined us here today for our NWSA webinar on wildfire and communities, produced by John Melton, a graduate student at the University of British Columbia, who also is a contractor with the BC Community Forest Association. Judah has spent most of his graduate studies thinking about wildfire and what it means to communities. We thought it would be a great opportunity to bring him on today to our NWSA webinar series to think about what you can do as a wilderness steward with planning for that wildfire event in your wilderness area adjacent to your community. We know that wildfire is a major component of wilderness areas, and it's only a matter of time before a wildfire in a wilderness will start to come out and potentially threaten nearby communities. It's good to have that pre-planning done in advance. We hope that this webinar will help assist you in doing some of that pre-planning with your local agencies, with your city and government officials, and just with your own neighborhoods and communities. So I'm joined here today with Dave Cantrell, our program committee chair for NWSA, also a past NWSA chairman. With Dave's guidance, he's been the one putting these webinars together, so we thank you for doing that, Dave. Would you like to say anything, Dave?
Just welcome to everybody, and Judah, it's great to see you.
You too.
All right, so Dave will be assisting me in answering questions as we go through the webinar today. What we're going to do is, in a minute, I'm going to turn it over to Judah for the presentation. We'd just like you to know that we will be allowing questions and answers at the end of the presentation. You should use the question function that you'll see on your dashboard for the GoToMeeting webinar. Just type out your question, and then we'll respond to each of them in turn at the end of the presentation. If for some reason you have any technical difficulties, need to communicate with either Dave or I, please use the chat function, which we'll be monitoring throughout the course of the presentation. So with that, just want to again remind everybody that NWSA is the national organization, the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance, that is supporting wilderness stewardship volunteer groups around the country, providing educational resources, trainings, and educational opportunities, the National Wilderness Workshop, and funding programs to help support you in your work on the national forests and in the National Wilderness Preservation System. So with no further ado, we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Judah. So Judah, we want to welcome you again with this presentation on wildfire and communities.
Great, thanks so much. Hello, everybody. So my name is Judah Melton, and I want to thank you all for joining us today for this webinar on communities and wildfire. And thanks to the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance for inviting me to speak on this topic today. So as I said, my name is Judah, and I'm a master's student at the University of British Columbia, and I research wildfire in the Faculty of Forestry. My research, which I'll talk about a little more in a minute, is focused on policy and economic solutions to wildfire risk in the interior of BC. And you can see my study site here in just a minute as well. I've also worked on two other major wildfire studies here in BC, first for the Tree Ring Lab at UBC, and then for a forest contractor on a Ministry of Forest project studying wildfire effects in old growth forest stands here in BC. I also work on contract for the BC Community Forest Association, and that's an organization that advocates for community forest tenure holders here in BC, and that's a specific type of forest license which is given to First Nations, local municipalities, or often some partnership between the two. And though I currently live in BC, I am from the US, and I completed my Bachelor of Science in Forest Biology at Colorado State University in 2013. It was during my time in my undergrad that I found my own love for wilderness in the US, first as a volunteer for Poudre Wilderness Volunteers, then as a wilderness ranger for the US Forest Service in the Black Hills National Forest. I also worked as a committee member for the programs committee here for NWSA as well. So my research began in earnest in about 2016. My study area, as you can see there on the map, is a region of the interior of BC called the Cariboo. Now, this is a diverse region, but I find it's comparable to areas in the US West, especially like the Front Range of Colorado, again, where I did my bachelor's. It's a dry region. There's mostly lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, or again, in the Front Range, that'd probably be ponderosa pine primarily. And the region has been hit hard by the mountain pine beetle outbreak, which I assume lots of you are familiar with at this point. And that's caused most of the focus here to be on pine stands, which has left Douglas fir stands to stagnate. Now, knowing that these dry, dense stands would not only be at a greater risk for wildfire, but that those unhealthy stands would also affect the region's timber supply, I set out to determine if there was a policy solution that could address both wildfire and the overall health of Douglas fir stands in the interior. So my case study has 3 parts. I first conducted interviews to get a better idea of how policy, economics, and social factors affect British Columbia's ability to reduce the risk of wildfire or take management actions that might be considered atypical. I then analyzed those findings to determine potential barriers to action that might arise in the area. And then I finally looked at the potential adaptation of stewardship contracting, which is a tool that the US Forest Service and the BLM use to address issues and overcome some of those barriers. So my research has had quite an industry, government, and timber focus. So how did I get there, or from there to communities? Well, before the start of my fieldwork, while Western Canada had definitely had its share of large destructive fires, much more of the focus here was still on general prevention, protection of the resource, and recovery of timber supply after wildfires. So that same summer, a fire ripped through Fort McMurray in Alberta, and the next 2 years saw record-setting fire seasons in BC as well. So now the focus here in BC and in most of Western Canada has begun to shift from looking at this as a strictly resource problem and much more on a community problem. And we've started, instead of looking from the forest into communities, we've started to stand in those communities and look out and say, what do we need to be doing to prevent disaster from happening in this community? So now with my work with the BC Community Forest Association, I've started to get a much more detailed understanding of the problems BC and other areas in the West face in regards to what we are starting to call the new normal of wildfires or of megafires. So that's a little bit about me. I wanted to just kind of situate myself in this discussion so you know where I'm coming from. I want to give you a quick idea of what I'm going to talk about today. First, I'm going to briefly discuss the state of wildfires in the Western US and Canada. I think that most of us that are concerned with wilderness stewardship are likely to be aware of most of the major fire events that have occurred in recent times, not only because the wilderness preservation or stewardship community tends to be a little more connected to those issues, but also because these are stories that have made national and often international news. So after that, I want to talk about how we got here and a little bit about how our understanding of that answer has changed recently. Then I'd like to briefly discuss how communities are affected by wildfires, and again, how our understanding of that answer has evolved. I think there are some things that we probably all can think of that are, major effects, but we started to learn some other things about those effects and some of the more nuanced factors that are at play. Then we'll talk about what we can do by ourselves and as members in our communities to address wildfire risk. And then finally, I'm going to share a few quick stories of communities I know that are taking kind of exceptional actions or using the tools available to them to address wildfire risk in their communities and in their regions. Then at the end, there should be some time for questions. And I should say that I'm certainly not a wildfire expert in all of the many facets of the field, but I will do my best to answer any questions you might have about the topic, about my presentation, my research, about wilderness or otherwise. So over the last 5 to 10 years, both in the US and in Canada, we have begun to see incredibly large fires. We've seen fires from the forest passing through urban communities. We've seen record-breaking numbers of evacuation, number of lives lost, value of property lost, cost of suppression activities, and so on. So again, as I mentioned, many of these stories have played out over both national and international media, so we'll be brief here. But I want to set the stage of where we are at before we talk about what we can do. So here's just a short list of some of the most notable fires over the last 4 or 5 years. We've seen quite a few things going on in California. I'll talk quite a bit about California. The Camp Fire was a really destructive and tragic story that I think, again, we're probably all aware of at this point. There's Fort Mac, which I mentioned. BC has had 2 record-setting fire seasons in 2017, 2018, and Washington had a record-setting fire in 2015. Now, if we go even just a little bit further back than that, still not even 10 years, we add even more jurisdictions to the list of jurisdictions with record-setting fires or fire seasons. So we have Colorado, Arizona, which not only had a record-setting fire season in 2011 with the Wildfire, but also the Yarnell Hill Fire is famous because tragically 19 wildland firefighters lost their lives in that fire. And then Oregon as well has had a record-setting season within the last 10 years. So most of the fires listed here have affected either large communities or they've affected completely urban areas. They've forced major evacuations or they've had an incredibly high loss of human life or property. So how did we get here? I think a lot of Americans and Canadians, especially in the West, have been more exposed more and more to the reasons behind these fires. I think typically in sort of a simplistic view, that's been thought of as the interaction between a legacy of a century of fire suppression combined with the effects of a change in climate. But as our knowledge and experience with these mega fires has increased, the reasons for why we got here or how we got here has been brought into a little more focus. Now, I want to use a few graphs from a really excellent article on the website 538, and that article is called Why California's Wildfires Are So Destructive in 5 Charts. You can see the link at the bottom if you want to read the whole article. It's really, really excellent, gives a great detailed but easy to kind of wrap your head around explanation of some of the data that's going into our understanding of the wildfire problem. So yeah, these graphs do such a good job. I wanted to share them with you. And while the article is specific to California, these issues play out in other states in the West as well as in Canada. Again, my knowledge is primarily centered in BC and Colorado to a certain extent, but what I know from learning from other academics, other research, other news, is that the situation is really similar no matter what the ecosystem type is, no matter what the governance structure is. We are seeing these issues pretty much everywhere that we're having these record-setting fires. So the first chart here shows the trend of average temperature in California going back nearly 125 years. Now, again, this isn't particularly new to our understanding of the situation, but if you look at the last 10 or so years, this time period that I've just talked about with these record-setting fires, average temperatures have taken quite a jump since, the 1980s and 90s, and since, the 60s when that rise really began. So it's definitely getting hotter. Well, it's also getting drier on average, so this is definitely the effects of climate change that we're seeing. Again, this is probably not very new to a lot of you. And while yes, some of these regions will likely get cooler and or wetter, by and large, hotter and drier is the overall direction we are headed in the western half of North America anyway. So this third graph from 538 points out that not all of California is in an actual drought, and this is important when we're thinking about the nuance, but it's not as important as the other graphs here. Just wanted to help tie in that we see changes in temperature and in precipitation, and they are making places like California hot and dry. But it's not just climate change that's caused this state of the new normal of megafires. In California, and in many other places in the western US and Canada, the warmer, drier conditions have not only impacted forest health directly, but it's also allowed outbreaks like mountain pine beetle to rise to epidemic levels, and that's left behind vast swaths of dead and dying trees. So as I mentioned briefly too, a century of fire suppression has led to overgrown forests, which increase the likelihood of those catastrophic wildfires due to increased fuel loading or greater loading of ladder fuels, which are fuels that carry fires from the ground to the canopy and allow fires to spread, and has also, again, allowed insects and disease to spread more rapidly, causing more tree mortality, leaving more fuel in the forest. Now, this has been the case across California and other forested jurisdictions in this part of the world for at least the last 10 years. Large destructive fires have occurred every few years since the early 2000s. But the last piece of the puzzle for how we've kind of wound up in the state that we're in now and seeing fires like Fort Mac and like in Paradise, California, is something that I don't think that we, even in academia, completely understood until recently. And again, especially after seeing fires like in Paradise and in other communities that lie much closer to that sort of urban side of the wildland-urban interface. So I've put 538's final graph here next to that of the dead trees because there's something I want to highlight here in the comparison. And this is one of the many ways as we see these changes are starting to interact and ultimately are leading us to these record-breaking fire seasons and lots of destruction, loss of life, big evacuations. As you can see, growing development there on the right in the wildland-urban interface, especially in California, is essentially sitting right next to these forests, which have seen incredible levels of tree mortality in the last decade or two. So that means we have more people living in places that are further into the trees, in forests where we have increased fuel loads and increased dry, dead timber. So that's kind of the last big piece of the puzzle. As populations in these areas continue to expand, the line between wildland and urban in that wildland-urban interface will continue to blur or expand. So we've started to really think about development and what effect local municipalities or communities can have on development as being an incredibly important piece to addressing the issue of wildfire risk in interface areas. So I want to take a quick minute to tie this into wilderness. Now, for those of you that know the wilderness preservation system well, you will know that wilderness doesn't necessarily mean it's the area is completely removed from civilization. So I've got one really quite easy example for me to make because it's the wilderness that I worked in for the U.S. Forest Service, which is the Black Elk Wilderness in southwestern South Dakota. You can see it there on the map. I want to zoom in and give you kind of a little bit closer view, maybe not completely clear on your screens, but hopefully you can see what's going on here. Now, the Black Elk is a prime example of wilderness that blurs that line between wildland and urban in the wildland-urban interface. It's nearly encircled by highways, and these highways are used by a lot of people. I mean, this is a not really densely populated area, but yearly, there are anywhere from 500,000 to 700,000 motorcycle riders annually for the Sturgis Motorcycle Rally. But there are also upwards of 30 million tourists that visit this part of South Dakota every year. And they're going to sites like Deadwood, Keystone, and Custer, which are rich in that sort of Wild West history. But then also to Mount Rushmore, which you can kind of see in the top right corner of the wilderness area there. It butts right next to Black Elk. And there are about 3 million people that visit Mount Rushmore alone every year. And this is happening almost exclusively in the hot, dry, fire-prone summer months. So a fire in the Black Elk could easily affect millions of people, depending on the context of when it happens and so on. So the Black Elk may be a little atypical when you compare it to the rest of wilderness areas in the US, but even some of those remote wilderness areas are likely to have some type of settlement, development, rural or otherwise, that a wildfire near one is likely to affect the other. So in the wilderness, the U.S. Forest Service often uses what's called minimal impact suppression techniques. Now, this is something that I, as a wilderness ranger in the Black Elk Wilderness, taught to wildland firefighters in the area so that if they come across a fire that is in wilderness, they know the right steps to make to leave that sort of no trace principle as close to in place as possible. Usually they will use this when there is a need to suppress fires in wilderness areas, whether that is because there is specific cultural or historical significance, or if they think that the fire is going to escape and will affect a community where loss of human life or property may occur. But in many wilderness areas, as I'm sure a lot of you know, the best option typically is to let it burn. the idea behind wilderness is that we are leaving them as natural as possible. And so fire, as I think, again, a lot of us are aware of by now, is an incredibly important part to forested ecosystem, even those ecosystems which aren't typically as dry as, say, ponderosa pine forests in Colorado. So communities can help keep wilderness wild by better protecting their own community, because that makes it easier for land managers, landowners, the government, wildland firefighters to make decisions that prioritize things like minimal impact suppression techniques. And this is a really simplified way to bring this discussion into the world of wilderness, but it highlights how interconnected everything is in regards to this topic. So not only are the reasons behind why we're here really interconnected, but the things that we need to do and why we need to be changing our focus and changing our approach and thinking a little bit more about how a community in a more urban area can have an impact on wilderness when they're not even in that wilderness area. So what are some ways that communities are affected by this new normal or affected by wildfires? Now, I'm sure most of you probably have things that immediately pop into your mind, so we're not going to talk about this for long. But again, just as our understanding of why we are here has increased or expanded relatively recently, so is our understanding of the effects that wildfires have on people and communities. We're starting to understand a lot of that kind of nuance behind, again, all of these interconnected things. So here you see where to like the obvious and then some of the less obvious effects that wildfires can have on communities. So for the obvious, we're talking loss of life, injury, loss of property, loss of businesses or income, loss of pets or livestock. Again, I think these are ones that, pop up immediately when we're thinking about this, but I want to talk here about some of the little less obvious reasons. And again, those have become more clear the more fires we've seen. There are the effects of smoke, both on the general population, but especially on the sick and elderly and often the young. And this is a really important one because this can affect even the most urban areas like Los Angeles or Vancouver or other areas which typically aren't thought of as part of the real wildland urban interface. They're not developed into the forest. But again, as we've seen in California, that line is starting to become blurred as well. We know a lot more about the mental health effects of wildfire now, especially in instances where you might be evacuated from your home, sometimes with little to no time to get out alive. And, again, talking about Fort Mac and Paradise, I'm sure lots of us have seen the cell phone video and news coverage of people on highways, driving right past a forest that is burning right up next to the highway. So that can be really, really traumatic, and even more so when you add on the obvious factors like loss of life or loss of property, loss of income. Now, loss to damage or infrastructure may be a bit more of the kind of obvious type of effect, but we're starting to see that effect play out more recently. In fact, just this year, there was a fire in Alberta which burned a railway bridge that effectively cut off the entire Northwest Territories from southern Canada. We also know a lot more about the long-term effects wildfires can have on watersheds, and of course those are vital to the communities in those watersheds. We know a little bit more about wildfire interruption of public services and the effect that that can have on communities, and especially can have on communities that are trying to rebuild after wildfire. And then finally, we are starting to understand that there are long-term effects on local economies, especially after large evacuations. Now, this is even more so the case in the kind of service or tourism industries, especially even more so when you think of shift workers who may immediately begin looking for work once there's an evacuation order or once they realize that it's going to be, sometimes weeks or even months before you get back into your home. And again, months to sometimes years for these communities to really get back to a place that they were in before an evacuation order, before a fire has come through their, part of their community. So what can we do? Now, I want to talk about some specific things communities can do, but I want to preface that by pointing out that some of the things that I'm talking about and some of the examples I want to give are going to be context specific. you know, there's so many differences in things like jurisdictional or management boundaries, population density or community size, local economic health or economic resource. Human capital is often really important in actually taking action. Your local governance structure, the presence of industry partners or nonprofit or non-governmental organizations, and more things like those will present opportunities for some communities and barriers for others. I also want to talk about a few more general things that we need to do sort of collectively to help reverse current wildfire trends. And then at the end of this, we'll try to tie it all together and give you some specific things that you can start thinking about in your communities. So first, I want to talk about the general, and that's that we need to change our focus, not only in terms of how we're managing forests, but in where we develop in and near those forests. Now, the issue of development is complex, and it must be addressed in the wildland-urban interface, or we might very likely see more fires like Fort Mac and Paradise. We also need to change our focus in much of this part of the world away from timber and take a more holistic view of the costs and benefits, both economic and not, of forests and the costs, both economic and not, of wildfire that happens in and around communities. So as an example of that, there's an effort underway here in Canada through a collaboration between the BC Ministry of Forests, Lands, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development, the Alberta Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, Parks Canada, and the University of British Columbia to develop a more detailed type of wildfire-specific cost-benefit analysis to take into account some of the effects I mentioned previously that we've begun to understand better. So this is taking some of those obvious factors and saying, well, of course, you know, our primary goal needs to be protecting life, protecting property, protecting critical infrastructure. But how do we start to look at the economic cost of mental health treatments after a fire for people with PTSD, and how do we incorporate that in our planning ahead to say, well, sure, maybe this operation or this project might cost the community some money, banding together to do something, but the long-term effects will produce benefits for that community. Now, finally, we need to change our focus from prevention or exclusion of fire and more towards ensuring our communities are resilient or adapted to wildfire. So those are some of the general things we need to kind of do collectively. It's sort of perspective shift that we need to have, but those aren't necessarily things communities or community members, I think, probably feel like they can directly affect. So what is it that communities can actually do? Well, first and foremost, the most concrete action that can be recommended to an individual in the wildland-urban interface looking to help affect change is to follow the guidelines set out by organizations like FireWise in the US or FireSmart in Canada. Again, this might be something a lot of us are familiar with at this point, but it's still important to bring up. Now, these essentially relate to limiting the proximity of things like trees, firewood, fuel storage, and other types of fuel from your home and the area immediately surrounding it. Now, as we've seen recently, not all fires in the wildland-urban interface remain in that wildland side. So this isn't an end-all be-all solution. You know, of course, once a large fire moves into a dense urban area, the proximity of structures or homes to each other is a much bigger factor in the spread of fire than strictly the trees or vegetation. So some more local efforts. In BC, community forests, which I'm involved in, allow communities that manage them to have a much more direct effect on wildfire prevention around their community, and of course, forest management around their community. In the US, again, this might be a little too context specific, especially with the proportion of federally managed land in the Western US. But again, still gonna be important to think about how some other communities are taking action and looking at the way that they are using the tools available to them and saying, okay, what are the tools available to me in my community? So for US communities, the first thing you can do is get informed and then voice your opinion through government meetings or things like the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, which allows for public input at certain stages in the planning and management process. You know, that's not always going to be effective, but it's sort of step one. Learn what's happening in the forest around your communities and learn what you can do to affect change, to have your say, your community say, heard in that planning process. You can also get involved in efforts to raise awareness of the other programs that I've mentioned, like FireWise and FireSmart. And then now I want to share a few quick examples of communities that are making their own efforts to protect themselves from wildfire. And then, as I said, we'll kind of tie this all together and give you some ideas of things you can do in your community. So the first example I want to share comes from a community here in BC. This community is called the Cowichan tribes, and their traditional territory, which you can see on the map here, covers a really large portion of the southeastern part of Vancouver Island, which borders Washington there at the top of the US. And that passes across the Strait of Georgia and follows up the Fraser River a little bit. And this is the most populous First Nation in BC at around 5,000 people. But unfortunately, they have been at in a time of unemployment, low economic status, due to a lot of factors from the history of First Nations relations with Canada, but we won't get into that too much. It's a little bit out of the scope. But as a part of an effort to help address some of those issues in the nation, they established a partnership, a part of which was this Cowichan Forest Services. So this is a community-run company that provides forestry and silviculture services in the community and the community forest, which is also held by that First Nation. So they've trained and employ members of their local public in forestry, and more importantly, they now train and employ multiple firefighting contract crews. Last year, for example, they had 9 different crews sent to fight various fires in BC. So they are helping to not only protect their community directly, but they're helping to protect other communities as well, all while bringing jobs and economic benefits into their community. Again, this is one of those things that might be a little context specific. Can every community, is every community able to have the sort of financial capital and human capital to start a forestry firefighting crew? Probably not. But again, this is, kind of an exceptional example of communities taking action. So moving to the US, there are similar efforts underway. In Northern California, for example, the Karuk tribe are using traditional knowledge and traditional use of fire to manage lands in their traditional territory. Again, very similar to the Cowichan in BC. The Karuk are part of a larger 10-year collaborative effort to improve forest health, in part by the use of prescribed fire or traditional use of fire. And this is a relatively recent project, was made possible by a new US Forest Service policy. And I want to point out that the Karuk have been fighting for a long time to have the right to have input on management decisions in their traditional territory. And there have been other projects or efforts to involve them that they have viewed as not being successful. So because this is such a new project, there's going to be a little time needed to see if this effort will be considered a success by the community. So as part of the community's efforts to address address wildfire risk in the region, there are other efforts underway as well. I think this is where we start to think about, okay, is this something that my community could do? So the Karuk in this area in Northern California, they have started a yearly training program for prescribed fire called TREX. And in this program, participants learn skills like how to create a fire barrier, how to determine safe weather and temperature conditions for prescribed fire, how to properly spray water to protect structural or other values. According to a story by Wired about this program, the youth who are trained in these programs carry out actual prescribed burns, then teach those skills and knowledge to their parents, which fills in generational gaps where traditions have been lost. So in First Nations communities, this type of thing is really important, not only for protecting their community from wildfire, but also for there's incredible cultural and traditional significance as well. So having programs like that, finding funding sources, finding places to set these up and coordinate training that doesn't necessarily have to go as far as learning how to light or control a fire, but to do things like understand how to protect structures using water can be really, really important going forward for a community. So a few other quick examples from the US. In Shingleton, California, which is again in Northern California, they have a Fire Safe Council. And this is a group of community members who sort of help lead the drive to get members of the community, to get neighborhoods, to get to that sort of fire safe standard. They help distribute information, they help set up these kind of trainings, find funding sources or business partners to help pay for some of the cost of doing these kind of things. So Tom Twist, who is a deputy of that Shingleton Fire Safe Council, has been pushing to install SR7 wildfire early detection systems. And these are systems that use infrared and optical cameras to detect growing wildfires. He said in a news article recently, the Camp Fire is a prime example of what happens when you're dealing with inadequate information in a rapidly developing wildfire. If the SR7 system had been deployed, it would have detected the fire and would have given the people of Paradise about an hour and a half more time to evacuate. So this is something that I want to highlight, that he talks about dealing with inadequate information. And I would say that, at least through my own experience and research, that information and communication are the two most important things in your community to think about. How do we communicate better, not only with our neighbors, but with the government, with emergency services, with the land managers that are, in those forests or in those wilderness areas that our community views as being stewards of that land. Also in California, there are efforts led by members of the community to develop woody biomass power plants to power rural communities in California. This would provide local economic incentive to reduce fuels, and obviously that bringing that power supply into the community will have an economic benefit as well. Unfortunately, one part of this process is stalled recently, and that is because extra energy that was going to come from these woody biomass power plants were going to sell their extra electricity generated into California's primary utility company, Pacific Gas and Electric. Now, if you pay attention to news about wildfires or about forests, or you're in California, you probably have heard recently that Pacific Gas and Electric has just declared bankruptcy, and this is primarily because of liability claims from wildfires like the Camp Fire. So liability is one issue that I unfortunately don't have a lot of real good advice for communities. It's also something that's really important, but is going to be context specific depending on, local laws, regional control, what type of governance system, what the capacity of your local emergency services, and so on. So something to think about, but unfortunately, again, not something that I really have the expertise to speak on. So there are similar efforts for this kind of utilization of fuel in California, and this may be one piece of the overall puzzle for communities looking to help protect themselves and their values against wildfire. So like I said, I want to kind of try to tie this all together, talking about some of these examples and thinking about some general things we can do and thinking about information and communication. So how do we kind of tie this all together? So, again, I want to take out some of that context-specific nature of this topic, and I thought I would end this talk by sharing the answer to the question, what can communities do? And I want to do that through the lens that I mentioned when I spoke about changing our focus, by not thinking of this as how do we prevent fire or exclude fire from our community or from our wildland-urban interface, and shift that to how do we better adapt to fire, or how do we make our communities more resilient to wildfire? So this graphic you see here comes from the National Fire Protection Association, and they're also instrumental in the FireWise program in the US. And this gives some very specific, but also kind of general things that can be done in and by communities to enable this shift to being fire adapted. Now, first, our landscapes must be managed in a way that prioritizes protection of values that are most important to communities, and also reduce the risk of wildfire in interface areas. Again, this is one of those kind of context-specific things where your community may have a better ability to participate in some of those planning actions. where some communities might be a little bit more prevented from doing that for various reasons. So what can homeowners do? Well, they can prepare themselves and their property through having household disaster or emergency plans. You know, again, this is very important for families to develop a plan of what do we do if we have to leave our house within an hour. And also, homeowners can, as I mentioned, protect their homes and their properties, and thus the properties and homes near them by using those FireSmart or FireWise principles. Then members of local community can get involved in or help to form collaborative partnerships, either to do things like help direct forest management, but also to help assist members of the community who may be less able to do things on their own, like fire smarting their homes, due to factors like age, health, household income, and so on. Now, as I've just mentioned, local communities or community members can get involved in government planning efforts, but especially when we're thinking about what you can do in your local community, is you can help push your local government to develop a community wildfire protection plan if there isn't one already in place. Again, the information and communication component of addressing risk and being prepared is the most important thing. And while it may not seem like much to have a plan written down on paper, because once that panic sets in, who knows what's going to happen, but that being the starting point, I think is really important for communities to think about where their greatest risks lie, where there might be some gaps in things like what homes are prepared and what are not. So that's kind of my go-to start for somebody wanting to do something in the community. We haven't talked about this at all, but fire department planning or EMS, emergency services planning and preparation, are key as well. So in collaboration with local municipalities, emergency response plans for the entire community can help that community be better prepared for disasters through training, through community risk assessments, and other efforts. And again, this information can help emergency responders identify higher risk areas or places that they might need to prioritize putting people in place when something like an evacuation occurs. Then finally, business owners can write pre and post disaster redevelopment plans to ensure recovery from a disaster like a wildfire is as quick and efficient as possible to minimize that long-term economic risk I mentioned before to communities. Business owners can also help sponsor training or information sessions for the community. They can often contribute to funding sources for bigger projects. So if you are a business owner in your community and you're thinking, what can I do as an individual? I would encourage you to also think about, what can my business do to give back to the community that sustains that business? So each one of these pieces here on their own is just one piece of a much larger puzzle of what we need to do to help address wildfire risk in and around our communities and to make our communities more resilient to wildfire. I think the takeaway that I would like to share after all of this is that, again, information, communication are the two biggest hurdles in these types of adaptive actions. And again, of course, finance is important as well, but a little less controlled by an individual in the community. Communities need to come together. They need to develop partnerships and collaborations to push forward things like fire hazard assessments, community wildfire protection plans, community disaster or evacuation plans. Is there a wildfire community group in your local area? Start one if not. Go to meetings, spread information about FireWise, FireSmart, and so on. Coordinate with your family, your neighbors, and be prepared to leave on short notice. So I hope I've given you all a little bit better understanding for the causes of the current state of wildfires in the US and Canada, the relationship between communities and wildfire, and most importantly, giving you kind of a starting point for some ideas of ways you can take action in your own community to help build resilient communities that are better adapted to fire. So up on the screen now are just a few links to programs I've mentioned earlier in case you weren't already familiar with some of them. The Fire Adapted Communities website especially has a great set of resources, including a Fire Adapted Communities self-assessment tool, which was created to help communities assess their level of fire adaptation. And I think that's a great sort of concrete starting point for communities or individuals in communities thinking about their own risk and their own ways to address risk. You have to understand, again, where those gaps are, things that you need to do to better improve before you can really think about the totality of what to do. So I want to thank you again for your time and attention today. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to try and answer some of them. Thank you.
All right, Judah, we want to thank you very much for bringing this information to us. And we do have, and so everybody, if you have questions, now's your time to send those in using the question dialog box on the dashboard for the GoToWebinar. So Judah, you've given us a great overview. Just a quick question that came to my mind is, who is the first contact? If somebody is in a community, who would you suggest they contact first if they're interested in learning more about their local area and who to engage with in this discussion?
Yeah, that's a great question.
First contacts.
Yeah, and again, the sort of context specificity of this topic, I think will change this for certain communities. But to give you a few ideas, if you're close to a national forest, that's a great place to go. They're really good at distributing that kind of information, and they are the ones that are sort of sitting at the top of that management chain who are making the decisions that are in the forest that are gonna affect that community. You can go to your local government, like a city council. At least here in BC, the city councils have started to become really good at organizing or helping to organize their communities to disseminate some of this information, to give homeowners an idea of like, where do I start first? And then I think probably sort of under those two would be emergency services. Talking to your local fire department about, though, if there are those kind of plans in place, getting them to help you with fire risk assessments and that type of thing, I think is kind of that other little piece of the puzzle, just to give you kind of a general idea of who to be thinking about to go to. If you're near a university as well, typically they'll have an extension office, and those are great resources, not only just talking about wildfire, but in any sort of a natural resource field, or if you've got a problem or a pest or protecting trees, they are always also really valuable resource to tap into for communities.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we do have our first question from Donna. We usually think about activities that we can do to prevent wildfire outside of wilderness. So Donna is asking, how can or are there forest management practices to reduce wildfire risks typically applied to wilderness areas, especially those that are smaller and close to urban interface?
Yeah, and, so each wilderness area is going to have its own plan for managing wildfire or preventing wildfire. From my experience in the Black Elk, our concern was less on preventing wildfire and more on ensuring that wildfire that escaped wasn't going to affect the community. So we did more work outside of the wilderness area boundary because we can use things like chainsaws, we can drive into sites and things like that. There is a certain challenge with working in wilderness in any capacity that once you remove those sort of modern tools, the work becomes becomes much less efficient. And so thinking about actually trying to reduce risk of wildfire in a wilderness, I think again, is going to be mostly dependent on if there are cultural or historical values in or near that wilderness that absolutely need to be protected. Otherwise, sort of my personal view on that would be we should maybe be just letting some of those, as unfortunate as it is, wildfires burn, because we need that inclusion of fire. We need to bring fire back into our ecosystems to return them to a more natural state.
And I would just add that in my years with the Forest Service, typically we would not take any cultural or treatment actions inside of wilderness but to manage for fire, but would work outside of wilderness boundaries to try to eliminate that spread from a wilderness to areas outside of wilderness. In
Right.
a few relatively rare exceptions, prescribed fire was considered and allowed in a number of locations where fires could have been shown to have been inappropriately stopped or eliminated, and that the fuel buildup was such that created an extraordinary hazard both outside of wilderness to life and property, and that they could do some controlled efforts in the wilderness that were appropriately modeling natural processes and allow that natural fire cycle to be restored and reestablished. Those typically tend to be rare, but they are allowed under the Wilderness Act. Are there any other questions? Dave, did you have anything you wanted to say?
Gina, terrific presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
My question also is about the matter of context. I know there are checklists for a community to look at what they have done to prepare. Is there any sort of tool that you know of that would help a community say, what are the contextual factors that we need to take into account? What is possible for our community and what is not?
Off the top of my head, I'm not aware of anything like that. I have to imagine that some, at the very least, some community has done something like that. Again, at least in BC, I feel like we're 5 to 10 years kind of behind where the US is because of our location and our climate. It's changed a little more slowly for us. So we are really just now on the cusp of catching up to all of this planning and templates and finding ways to standardize the information so that a community doesn't have to dig through 10 websites to find out, oh, what are some funding sources available to a community to, for example, to reduce the risk of wildfire in those interface areas. So unfortunately, I don't actually have a good suggestion there for where that kind of like a template might be.
Maybe you can write one this weekend.
Maybe, yeah.
Randy, I'm not seeing other questions, are you?
We just had one come in. Is there any way to protect a forest from beetle or bugs that lead to tree death, thereby providing or provoking wildfire fuel and widespread outbreak? So that's more of a natural resources question, Judah, but from your experience, other thoughts on on how we can improve our forests so that they are less susceptible to wildfire risk?
Yeah, they're, of course, because of how destructive the most recent mountain pine beetle outbreak has been, there have been a lot of efforts to kind of understand this question a little more and think about what we can do to prevent those outbreaks from becoming epidemics. But again, just like wildfire, those insects and diseases are really important for the general health of forested ecosystems. So, and we're not really thinking about how do we stop bugs completely, but how do we limit their spread? How do we limit their effect on things that we value, like, primarily here right now, it's the timber that we're thinking of. So there are things that can be done from a management perspective as far as spacing or thinning trees so that there's a greater distance. Insects and diseases are less likely to spread. And this is one thing that is kind of contested. We talk about thinning in the context of wildfire as well, but there is a contingent of the academic community who aren't convinced that more activity in the forest is going to bring us to where we think we need to be. So I think it's part of the puzzle. I don't think that there is, unfortunately, an end-all be-all solution for any of the problems that our forests face in North America or across the world. So again, that's, you know, a very context-specific thing where one forest might really need to sort of go all out on a thinning program to, you know, set up trap trees to catch beetles so that they can eradicate them. Whereas a wilderness area you may just have to let that go through. Again, in the Black Elk, I had started working there kind of at the tail end of the beetle outbreak in that part of the US. And it was too late to do anything. So again, our concern there was less on how do we stop it and more how do we adapt to it? How do we make sure that we're keeping up with danger trees that are hanging over trails that humans might be on? What do we need to do to remove those trails so that we can continue to keep the impacts on the resource, on that wilderness area consolidated? So again, lots of things that go into making those decisions or thinking about what can we do to prevent or to limit the cost of insects and diseases in our forests.
Right. We have a very complex system, and we've set aside and designated wilderness areas to allow natural forces to run free, play as close to their natural role in the environment as they can. And so we're going to see these situations happening where we have widespread bug, insect, and disease occur, but hopefully they will be within nature's bounds and be within the natural ebb and flow that we would see in a natural situation. But now that we are faced with some external activities like climate change and changing weather patterns, heat and cold, the effects of some of these systems are the swings, the variations are getting much greater. So it's important for us to work together in our local communities to try to come up with local solutions that can help address those situations. They're only going to increase, and I think we're going to find that they're only going to continue to dominate our discussion in the days ahead.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
We've used up our time for today. So Judah, any parting comments?
No, I think, you know, like I said, hopefully I've left you all with an idea of where to start. You know, that fire adapted communities, I think is a great launching point for anyone who's just now starting to think about what you can do in your community.
Yeah, we appreciate that very much. Dave, any parting comments from you?
Judah, I noticed that your last slide has an email address on it. I assume that people could contact you if they have questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Terrific.
All right. Well, we want to thank again our audience for coming and participating today in this webinar on wildfire and communities. Just note that our next webinar will be in October, the second week, where we'll be talking about a recent survey that was completed on wilderness stewardship groups and what it takes for wilderness volunteers to want to be feel included and a part of a broader organization. We'll have Rebecca Nymick from the Colorado State University and the graduate student Martha Beirut, who will join us and go over the results of that survey. So we hope you'll join us. That is going to be, Dave, what's the date again? My phone is acting up here.
Let me see if I can dig it out.
It's the second Tuesday in October.
Yeah, October 8th, Tuesday, October 8th, 1 o'clock Mountain. Becky Nemick and her grad student, Martha B. Reut, both talking about the results of that very important, I think, revolutionary survey.
All right. Well, with that, we're going to close out today's presentation. Thanks so much for participating. And again, you'll find a recording of this presentation on the NWSA website in about a week. We thank you so much, and this will conclude.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay.